Hello there. This is Bill Rogers Sunday School class, and we're studying the Gospel of John. We're in chapter 18, the betrayal of Jesus today. And I'm just going to jump right in and read the scripture passage. Okay, in chapter 17 is what we had last week. It's called the Great High Priestly Prayer that Jesus makes for his disciples and for people that are going to follow after them, which includes us. And so as they have left the upper room and they have moved to the Garden of Gethsemane, as is named in some of the other Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have a story about the betrayal, and each has slightly different details. And so we'll be touching base perhaps with some of those. Chapter 18, verse 1, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron. Some translations call it brook. The Greek word underlying this is not a single word in English. It means winter torrent. And if you think about the seasonal rainfall that they had in that arid or semi-arid part of the Mediterranean region, there were more rain in the winter time because of weather patterns. And so this would be a ravine or a dry gully with just a little trickle of water, perhaps, part of the year, and at other times it would be something you couldn't pass. Now, if you will remember that at the Passover time, some estimates are that 100,000 Jewish people from all around the Mediterranean region come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, and that's this week, which is the full moon, which comes into the narrative a bit, kind of in a sideways fashion in just a moment. But so Jesus and the disciples go forth over this ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden, and the other gospel writers name it Gethsemane, into which he himself entered and his disciples. The other gospel writers say he was staying there. So if you think of thousands of people taking up all available space, perhaps this private garden, it would have been walled. Jesus may have known the owner and gotten permission for them to stay there. They were basically camping during the week of the Passover. And so they have gone into this garden, and its name means olive press. Now, on this side of the ravine is the Mount of Olives. And guess what they grew there? It was olive trees. And so an olive press would have been a useful thing to be located very close so they could take the olives and squish them between two big stones and press out the oil and collect it. And they got olive oil that way. They didn't put the pimentos in them and pickle them in brine there. Okay. That's a joke. Okay. Now, verse 2, it says this. Now, Judas also, who was betraying him, knew the place, for Jesus had often met there with his disciples. Parenthesis. It is not particularly clear that this was Roman soldiers plus the temple guard. We know that we have the temple guard, but the word here that's going to show up is cohort, which meant anywhere from 200 to 600 Roman soldiers. We think it would have been really crowded for 600 Roman soldiers. The word is a technical word, so it seems to imply that the Roman soldiers were involved, and the high priest had been able to get a favor from Pilate to get a bunch of guards. Now, they did have they were allowed to have their own temple guard, which were the people who guarded the propriety of the temple compound to make sure that no Gentile person went past the court of the Gentiles. And so they were allowed this under Roman rule to have these guys, which would have been armed to protect the sanctity of the place, is another way to say it. Mark's gospel has an intriguing detail at the end of it, and that is an unnamed young man, which now the scholars assume is Mark referring to himself, is there basically in his pajamas. It's in a single piece of cloth, and as they try to arrest people, the disciples flee. They grab the cloth as he runs off, and this unnamed young man runs off naked. And so the notion is this, is that the upper room was rented from Mark's family, and he was a young boy. And so the thought is that Judas then comes back with some of this group to ask which way did they go. And then John Mark, knowing this, runs ahead to try to warn them. And then they would have had to go regather and then end up going to the Garden of Gethsemane. But the notion is that these guys were camping out in this walled garden named the Olive Press, and that's where Jesus had gone to pray. And they've been going there at nights during the week. On the other side of the top of the Mount of Olives was where Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived, just a short distance away. So they were familiar with these places, and now Judas and the bad guys show up to arrest Jesus. And it says, verse 2, now Judas also, who was betraying him, knew the place, for Jesus had often met there with his disciples. And the other gospel writers imply that that's where they were staying, actually. Then Judas, then having received the Roman cohort, my New American Standard interpolates the word Roman. It's not in the original, it's just cohort. And the officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Parenthesis, lanterns and torches, plus the new moon. The moon would have been shining very near the new moon. And so clear night skies in this semi-arid region. Why would they have to have torches? My Sunday school teacher pointed out, some people thought, well, we're going to have to seek in all the nooks and crannies for them when we get there because they're going to be hiding from us. And so they came prepared for something that didn't happen, which was prepared to look for Jesus and his disciples. But they come also with their weapons. Okay, Judas then, having received the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. The actual betrayal with a kiss, John does not mention, but that's a detail that the other gospel writers include. I don't remember if it's all three or not. So at this point, an interesting turn of events happens. Jesus steps forward. Jesus, therefore, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, whom do you seek? So this notion is it's a walled garden with a little gate, and Jesus goes out. Here's this crush of people have come right up to the place, and he says, who are you looking for? He steps right out. There's no resistance. Jesus instead is in charge. But John says he knows what's about to happen. So we think he's going to be arrested. He's going to have multiple trials. Then he's going to be taken to Pilate, back and forth, taken out on the balcony. Who do you want to release? He's going to be scourged. He's going to be given the crossbeam to carry. He's going to be too weak to carry it. They're going to conscript, oh man, now I've forgotten the name, Simeon, isn't it? And to help carry it to the place of crucifixion. He's going to be crucified. He's going to die. He's going to give up his spirit. Jesus knows all of this in advance. Jesus knows what's going to happen over the course of the next, let's say this is 10 o'clock at night when these guys show up. 10 o'clock at night, 10:30 at night. By sundown the next day, he's going to be dead. Jesus, knowing all that's going to happen, steps out of the little garden area, steps out of the, from inside the walled compound and says, who are you looking for? And they say, Jesus the Nazarene, or Jesus of Nazareth. And of course, linguistic differences make it not a one-word translation there. Jesus Nazarene may have been exactly what they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And so John just says he was standing there. Now, the other gospel accounts say Jesus has told them, the one that I kiss, that's the one. So I'm going to go kiss the teacher, and he's the one I'm going to greet him that way. And that's the one, keep your eye on him and don't let the others get all scrambled up and let him get away. All right. And so, but instead, Jesus just steps out and he says, who are you looking for? And then note the following. When therefore he said to them, I am he. He said to them, I am he. And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with them. When therefore he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. You've got to add this to the other I am statements we have noted as we've gone through John. I am the bread of life. I am the door of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the water of life. You know, all of these I am statements. And then Jesus is simply saying, I am. The he is interpolated to put it into good English. Now we go immediately back to the Old Testament with Moses at the burning bush, and he asked God for his name, and he says, who shall I say sent me? And God says, I am that I am. So my read of this has always been, and it's a minority read, is that Jesus proclaiming his name, I am, as God, is an outbreak of divine glory of such power and potency. These guys are blown backwards. They take a step back and they fall to the ground. And may have fallen like dominoes, the front row falling into the back. Right? It's kind of a humorous picture. Here they are ready to arrest the guy. He's standing there, but just the little word, they fall over. Now, there's also the account in the Gospels where Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am, and they take up stones to kill him because they would have considered it to be blasphemy, right? But what they considered to be blasphemy actually was truth. So it wasn't blasphemy after all. It was just, he was just speaking facts. And so when they say, who are you looking for? And Jesus of Nazareth, and he says, I am. Whammo, they're on the ground. And so they get up and pick up their weapons and brush themselves off. What just happened here? And so that's my read of it. Again, therefore, he asked him, who did you say you're looking for? Whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus the Nazarene. He said, I told you that I am. If therefore you seek me, let these go their ways. Jesus is taking care of the guys. And John points out that this is a fulfillment of something in his prayer that he just prayed in the last chapter. John just recorded in the last chapter. He says that the word might be fulfilled which he spoke of, those whom thou hast given me, I lost not one. Oh, that had a thou in it, didn't it? That's one thing I don't like that much about the New American Standard. Otherwise, it's a really interesting and useful translation, but they selected thou for the prayer type portions of the Bible, but these and thous. Okay, but Jesus says, I will lose none except for the son of perdition. And so he's noted an exception for Judas, but now Judas has gone over to the other side. Jesus is here with the 11, maybe some other disciples that followed along very closely in those times. And we think of Matthias, who is chosen to get Judas's place. You know, not all the disciples are named every time, you know, of course, but you'd say there's this cluster of guys. He says, let these go. And that's an answer to the prayer that he prayed that John recorded back in chapter 17. Now, Mark says, and they all fled. They ran off. I can see them jumping the fences, you know, if it was a low fence, scrambling. And then Peter and John run off, but then they come back and follow, if you're following all the narratives, because they go to the high priest's house next. With Peter and John are out there in the record. The total picture, all the pieces put together. It's fascinating to try to put all the pieces together and make it chronological. And so that's fulfilled. Verse 10, Simon Peter, therefore, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave or servant and cut off his right ear. Now, the picture is, okay, how do you cut off a man's right ear? If you're right-handed, the right ear's on that side of the head. Okay, so how did he do this? Did he swing it and the guy ducks and catches his ear? Maybe it was a dull sword. It's the word here is a short sword. And here's something I have never understood or don't know, is that in the passages, it talks about Jesus saying, do you have a sword? He said, yeah, we have two. He said, that's enough. And now he's going to say, put your swords up, and he's going to heal the guy's ear. I wonder how they knew the guy's name. Let's read just a moment here. Simon Peter, therefore, having a short sword, almost a dagger, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. And the slave's name was Malchus. So did Malchus become a believer after this? Did he line up with one of Jesus' followers? And so forever after, he says, look, here's the ear that Jesus put back on. You know, Peter over there tried to slice my head off, and I ducked, and he got my ear. And it's a marvelous little attention to detail that makes us think, good grief, this is an eyewitness account. That why would you just throw in that little detail? Except he was there and he saw it. So at verse 11, it says, Jesus therefore said to Peter, put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? And so the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. So it doesn't say in John, yeah, and the other guys ducked down. That we go to the other accounts for that. So there is this initial resistance or willingness to die for Jesus that Peter has. An admirable notion, although he did not know what he was up against. I mean, if there were 200, let's say the minimum number, 200 Roman soldiers, plus the temple guard, plus religious leaders who were there to make sure everything was done in order. And he's one guy with a switchblade coming in. That's the old cotton patch gospel. Look that up. They say switchblade in the cotton patch gospel. Here he's willing to take them on. You know, I said I would die for Jesus, and you guys get back. And he's after them, you know, and Jesus said, put it back in the sheath, put it back. Shall I not, what's the word? The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? He's using this cup metaphor, drinking this bitter dose to the very end that God has given him. He knows what it's going to be like. He says, this is the way it's going to go. Okay, you put your sword up. And they tie Jesus up. They bind him. Basically, today, they put the handcuffs on him and they arrest him. What happens next is, so the Roman cohort commander bound him and led him to Annas first. Parenthesis. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Okay. The Annas had been high priest from like 6 BC to 15 AD. And then the Romans came in and interfered in the religious order of things that was supposed to be hereditary. And they said, we're in charge here. We pick and choose. We'll let you have your own religion. We'll let you have your own religious court. You cannot exact the death penalty anymore. Only we can do that. But we will let you guys go on like you've been going on all these years. And so they take Annas out. He had 3 or 4 sons. Each of one served as high priest sequentially. And then it was the turn for the son-in-law, Caiaphas, to be high priest. John notes the following. So Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews, actually the Sanhedrin, that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people, speaking prophetically and not knowing it. And so at this point, we see John and Peter are in the courtyard. We'll pick that up perhaps in next week's lesson. But that's the passage for today. Jesus is arrested, and we see, most noteworthy, he's in charge. He is following his Father's will. He steps out and says, who are you seeking? There is this demonstration of God's power where, like he tells in another of the gospel accounts, I could have had 12 legions of angels come down, and a legion was 1,000. If you think of an angel as a little guy about that big with wings and no breeches on and a little bow and arrow, think instead of a being the size of a 747 jet airplane, and with the power to just destroy at will upon command of God. Jesus said, my side has these outnumbered. Calm down. We're going to do it like God has planned it. And then he says, let these others go. You've come for me. You don't have a warrant with their names on it. They're not going to resist anymore. So let's just go on. And there, I think they've noticed 6 trials, because Jesus goes before Annas, he goes before Caiaphas. There's a trial with Pilate to Herod, and then back to Pilate. I think that's the order of things. No, there's a Sanhedrin trial in there. I'll have to review before next time. But that's today's lesson. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed it. And we're looking at continuing these for at least through the end of this quarter, which will be to finish the Gospel of John. And then we'll see if there's any further need. Thanks for tuning in.